as we look at what's happening with events here in the West, I think most of us are aware of the drought situation that we're in. And so that's one of the reasons we're going to talk about water. If you were with us on Monday, we had a big session on water and the drought situation and how we can improve water. And you're going to hear water come up in a lot of presentations, I think. You know, that's one of those features that's there. If we look at Utah, we can still see that for the most part, we're under severe drought and even in some areas, extreme drought. And it looks like we're getting lots of water, but one needs to remember that from an ag perspective, we get our water out of reservoirs and out of rivers. And by the time the end of season comes around, oftentimes we're a little bit short on water. And our individual that from the Utah Water Advisory Commission, they talked to us on Tuesday about the fact that we're not out of the drought. So don't think we're out of the drought. So we're going to talk about water because it's really important for us to talk about that. So when we're thinking about crop performance for our cucurbit crops, whether we're talking about growing winter squash or watermelons, water is going to be a key component of it. And then we're going to also talk about some nutrient management because it's also equally important for us to understand that. When we're dealing with water management, we need to know something about our soils. We need to focus on that soil component, and we're going to help you try to develop a better schedule this year so that you can deal with water use a little bit more uniformly, and we can optimize that in a way that's going to help you both save water, which is going to be important, but if we do run into situations where we're a little short, we can also make sure that we're giving the plants what they need so that we're not impacting our productivity in any way. And so we're going to show a few improvements. I think many of us are familiar with these already, but certainly if we can start to switch our farms over to using more drip, if we can start to integrate more mulches in it, and that mulch could be plastic mulches or organic mulches. Basically what we're trying to do there is minimize the amount of evaporative loss that we have. And then by going to drip, we're putting water right where plants are. Similarly, when it comes to nutrient management, we also need to be thinking about soils. You know, it's very easy to over or under apply. And if you paid any attention to the farm talks, fertilizer costs are through the roof, and we need to, you know, figure out ways to kind of minimize that without impacting our productivity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about scheduling in particular that relates to the vegetable, the cucurbit crops. So let's talk about water first. So we know that if we get optimal amounts of water, we get healthier plants, we get better yields, we get better fruit quality. All of those things are important to us. And Nick Volosky is going to talk a little bit later about diseases and some of those kinds of things. And many of those are associated with situations where we're just not being careful with our irrigation, and that can impact how the crop is responding to disease pressures that are out there. Certainly, we know when we over irrigate, that brings back in nutrients again, and that it's very easier for us to leach nutrients out of the system. And that then in turn is a water waste, but it's also a resource waste. And what we're trying to do today is minimize that. By the same token, though, if we are too careful with our water, then we got quality issues that are there. And we really need to have those fruits be kind of the best quality they can be. And so certainly in things like cucumber and summer squash, we may get blossom end rot, which is a water-related nutrient deficiency that shows up. And so, you know, just understand that that's a problem that we can deal with. If we don't grow enough leaf area, then we can get fruits that are exposed and they tend to sunburn. And then that's a problem for us in terms of quality as well. And we may not be able to market those fruits as well. So it's important to understand that, you know, when we're up here in the wet area, we don't want to be there, and we don't want to be down here in the dry area. And really, ideally, we want to be in this kind of area where the soil water is easily available to the plant, and it's optimal for the performance of that particular plant. It's not too wet, it's not too dry. I call it the Goldilocks thing. Remember the Goldilocks? She went in and found hot porridge and cold porridge and just right porridge, and she found soft beds and hard beds and just the right bed. What we want to do is get into this Goldilocks area, this where it's perfect for the particular plant. And so therefore we need to understand that while all of this water is going to be available, there's really an amount where at some point we've depleted enough water out of the system that we are getting into the point where the plant begins to get stressed. And then that means we're under available water, and that can then lead to secondary problems for us. So if you do not know what your soil water holding capacity is, you need to find this out. Okay, here's a good table. Do you have sands? Do you have loams? Do you have clays? If you do, that means you have different amounts of total available water. That's in that section in the middle, where it is. But remember, the allowable part that we want to focus on is how much is readily, easily available, or this is my Goldilocks area. How much water should I extract out of that? And then from that, we're going to be starting to use that to help us make decisions about when to irrigate and how much to irrigate and do those things. Stress isn't always noticeable in plants. And so when it's getting to the point where it's stressed, that creates a problem for us, and we're trying to deal with that. And so many of our vegetables, we only allow a certain amount of water to be used in that available range, and that's the allowable depletion. And we're going to focus our attention on that. Many of us use different types of irrigation systems. They have different levels of efficiency, and that is how well the operator runs. If I just run water through my furrows too fast, more water runs out the end that soaks into the soil. If I have soil structural problems, that can create problems for me. And if I'm only getting 50% of the water available to that particular plant, from a management perspective, that's a problem. That means I have to run water twice as long through this, and I may be actually short supplying them. If I'm doing overhead irrigation with a sprinkler or something like that, it has better efficiency. But if we run that pressure too high, then more of that water is evaporating back into our dry air, and that means less is coming to the plants, and so that's a problem. And if I'm using something like drip irrigation over here on the right, now I got better efficiency, but I've seen farmers that have had poor efficiency with drip systems because they've got leaks all over the place. They've got holes punched in it. They got wet spots out in the field because they've just not managed that system well or set it up appropriately, and therefore the efficiency can be pretty bad. So using these efficiency numbers will also help us make some decisions as to how much water we're going to put into the system. Now, on Tuesday, I talked about scheduling. I'm going to talk about it again simply because I think it's so critical, and I've been harping on growers to try and set up systems to schedule things, because then you know what you have. And those growers that have started to schedule better are also then producing higher yields. They're producing better quality, and that's bottom line dollars in your pocket. So an easy way to do that. What do we need to do? We need to first figure out how much water is lost each day. So we call that the estimate of our daily water use, and we call that ET reference. That just says this much system goes out of the system, and it's a calculated number that any weather station can provide you. And so you need to find a weather station close to your farm and then go and get those numbers and download them and put a file together so that you know roughly on June 20 how much water is going out of that system. The second thing then we do is we try to estimate how much coverage there is. And this is a simple way of doing it. It just says, take a ruler. I know how far my rows are. Now I'm going to estimate how much space is covered by those particular plants that I'm interested in. And that gives me some idea of percent cover. And that is a pretty easy number to calculate. And then I'm going to use that efficiency number. I'm going to try and figure that out. And sometimes that's a guess, but it's a safety factor so that we aren't running short on water as we've talked about. And then that's going to give us some benefits. Now, once I have this reference ET, what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert that into a value called ET crop, which I have to do some crop coefficient to do that. And a simple way is to look at how much coverage we have. Oh, here's my row spacing, how much plant is covered, and then I'm going to use these crop coefficient values to multiply by my daily reference value to get back to the actual amount that the crop is using. So we go to Climate Center data or to a local weather site to get those kinds of information. I already know what my soil can hold. And from that, I'm going to estimate how long I need to run my irrigation system. And then to be on the safe side, I'm going to over apply a little bit because I know that my irrigation system is not efficient. I'm not 100%. So if it was 100% and you could assure yourself that it was 100%, then I don't need to change that number any. So we're going to add a little bit. And you can see that, you know, as we get more coverage, our actual crop coefficient values tend to increase. And so that means the amount of water that I'm applying is also increasing because the plant is actually needing more as it's growing. So let's do some simple calculations. Don't get freaked out. This is just simple math. Anyone can do this. I know you're capable of it. So we're getting ET crop from our reference by our crop coefficient. And if we use our reference for the day in Salt Lake City, we're harvesting cantaloupes. It's late August. That says we're going to need about 1/4 inch of water a day. If I got a crop coefficient at harvest of 0.72, which it came from our previous table, I multiply those two values together, 0.25 times 72, which says that the crop is using about 0.18 inches of water per day coming out of the system. I'm working with a loam soil. I got that from back there, which said each foot of soil has about 2 inches of water available in it. And I need to know something about the rooting depth of that particular crop because that tells me something about how much water in the whole profile the plant extracts from. And I'll show you some figures that kind of reference back to that. And we know that cantaloupe roots down to about 1.5, maybe 2 feet. The number of roots that are down at the 2 feet zone are pretty small, so they're not taking up a lot of water, but the bulk of them are in that top 1.5 foot of soil. So using those numbers, now what I can do is it says I got 2 inches per foot. So that means I've got another inch and another 1/2 foot. So that means I got 3 total inches in this 1.5 foot divided by how much it's using per day. And that calculates out to about every 16 days, I'm going to need to irrigate. Now, that means that in that allowable zone, all of that water would be available to me. But I also know from what we said before is that I don't want to extract all of that water out of there. I only want to take a part of it in the Goldilocks zone. The top little component of it is what's there. So my allowable amount is I'm only going to take 1/3 of that water out of that system, which basically says every 5 to 6 days, I need to be thinking about watering my particular crop so that the plant isn't under any stress. And that's then gives me a real good system to work with. Now, which irrigation system do I have? I'm going to have to change this if I have a less efficient system, or I'm going to be pretty close to this if I'm using a drip system that's fairly efficient. Now, another issue, do I have water every day? That's always a big problem for us. And if I'm running out of a canal or something and my water turns are every 7 or 8 days, then I've got a bit of a problem. Then I got to just kind of accept the fact that I'm going to do this. And that means that I'm going to be less efficient with my irrigation. If I have stored water, if I have access to a pressurized system where I can draw a little bit of water out of that every day, we need to also do that. And that's a really nice way for us to regulate that and use that as a technique to help us get some better growth. Now, we've been working with some of our melon growers over the last few years. Here's a farm down in the south where You know, we've got a little bit of plant coverage. It's not very much. We got a lot of plant coverage here. We can see some open areas still in the field. So we assumed that it wasn't quite 100% covered, but it was about 95. And then we went through and looked at that ground cover relative to the crop coefficients that we were at. We kind of came up with a model that depicts certainly how much water the plant is using over time. And then when we did that, the grower was like, can I save water? What impact is it going to have on me in a very hot type of climate? Well, what we ended up seeing is if we went with a lower depletion amount, only a third of an inch, or a third of the amount of water, or half of the amount of water, we actually in some instances saw slight reductions in the amount of productivity. In some years we didn't see any change. In other years it wasn't very different from each other in terms of what the melon yield was like. And so he could make a decision about, oh, I'm going to use a little less water this year, and I'm not really sacrificing, because my yield goal, and you need to know that as a farmer, how much do I need to produce? If I need to produce 25 tons, then I'm above my yield. If I'm using it this way, I'm getting pretty close to that number if I'm actually saving a bit of water. And that can then actually save a lot of dollars on your particular farm. Also note that there are other ways that we can track water that makes it a lot more efficient. We can put sensors out there, and we can use things like plastic mulches. Note the two yellow lines on this graph. They depict what is happening with soil water, either up near the surface at the 8-inch depth in plastic versus this black line here, which is at the 8-inch depth in bare soil. And we can see that they tend to track pretty much by themselves, and would suggest that, yeah, water is changing. This red line here says I'm going to deplete water out to about 50%. You can see that there's a little incidence where the surface is getting pretty dry, but what's happening down at the 18-inch depth? I've got adequate amounts of water down there in both of these systems, but actually my plastic is actually using less water. And so that tells me an awful lot about how efficient I am at doing my system. I'm not flushing water deep into the profile. I'm not drying the soil out too much there. And when I do run an irrigation event, I can build that soil back up to where it's up almost near field capacity, which is right around this 10 line. And that then looks like I'm doing a really efficient job. And when we do this over the course of the whole season and then calculate how much gallonage of water, when we're using plastic, we can reduce our water use by thousands and thousands of gallons each year, which is pretty good savings for us. We need to know, once again, our soil types. So different soils have different release rates for these sensors. And so all of that type of information really gives us some heads up on what we're doing. Now, let's switch gears and go to nutrition. We got about 10 more minutes. I want to talk about nutrition. Note that we got different elements that are there, and it's important for us to do that, but we're talking about, can we save nutrients this year as well? Certainly, it comes back to soil testing. If we don't know what our soil is, and like with water, when we don't know how much nutrients are in there, that's a problem for us. So kind of our target values are, we should have about 20 to 40 parts per million of phosphorus, about up to 200 in potassium. We may need some magnesium. We might need some zinc in our soils. We might need some manganese, those kinds of things. Use the analytical lab. If you haven't run a soil test before, get one. If it's been a few years, get one. They're not that expensive. The problem comes is that look at where we have no response for a particular crop. And cucumbers and melons and stuff are the same. If we have relatively high phosphorus levels, high potassium levels, you're not going to get any benefit from adding more fertilizer there. You're just spending money on something that's not giving us anything. So we got to try and avoid that. And the only way I know what's going on, and I can't advise you on what to do unless I know what your soil is. So here's some nutrient needs. Soil test first. Now, I'm going to talk about nitrogen because nitrogen has been one of the big ones that we need in order to grow the crop. If we know what our soil has in terms of its organic matter, and I know if there's any residual nitrogen in our system, I can use that to credit against what I need to know for what the crop requires. And so this nitrate number is a good one you can get from a soil test, and it's well worth looking at that. Many of our soils that are water that comes out of wells and things like that has some nitrogen in it. And we might as well use that to help save us. Note what the difference in the pricing of nitrogen is. Urea is about 80 cents per pound of nitrogen. If we're going to go to a liquid form, liquid urea ammonium nitrate in 32, which is a liquid form, it's about $1 a pound. And if I'm going to go to an organic source of fertilizer for nitrogen, this is feather meal, we're talking it's about $3, over $3 a pound. So it makes good sense to know what I'm going to do and how I'm going to use that in order to try and minimize the amount of N that I'm going to put into the system. So if I can credit it based on nitrate, that multiply 3.6 times the soil and water nitrate content, that and credits 36 pounds of nitrogen, so that in effect, rather than 150, I now only need 114 pounds of nitrogen. And at 80 cents a pound, that doesn't seem like a amount, but if I'm growing a lot of crop, then that's quite a bit of money. If I'm using an organic source, that's a lot of money that I've got. So generally, when we don't know anything, we recommend that you put on these amounts. My emphasis to you is know what you're doing rather than just do what you've done, because fertilizer is only going to get more expensive as time goes on. I don't see it coming back too far for us. There's been some retraction, but not a lot. So just expect to pay for it. Now, how do we time that? Well, on the graph over here, it says early in the growth of the plant, the first 2-3 weeks, we don't have very deed, need, so the amount of nitrogen that I need over here is relatively low. And I'm growing lots of vines, I'm growing lots of flowers, I'm starting to size fruits. I need a lot of nitrogen, so my needs go up. A good way to think about that is with a sliding scale. And we can say, well, I need about 1 pound per day for the first 2 weeks when I'm in this area here. So right here after when my needs are low, I don't need much. I can stick that on 1 time a week, which is adequate. I maybe am not irrigating every day, so that's a not normal way to do it. But now I'm up in this high need zone, I'm going to have to add a lot more. So I'm back to this 114 that we talked about in the previous one. Oh, I'm pretty close to that. I've got a little bit of pre-nitrogen that I put down on. So now I'm at my 150 level. I'm timing it based on what the crop needs, and the net effect of that is savings. And so we've done that. I've worked with some of our growers around the state that are growing melons, and many of the bigger growers are now doing this. There is absolutely no reason why our small growers can't use this same type of approach, whether it's in your small urban farm, your intermediate size farm. And if you need help with this, we can actually come and talk to me, call me, email me. We can work out some schedules for you that will make you a lot more efficient in what you've done. So when we're all done, we wanted to get about 150 units. We're able to do that, and the net effect of that is savings. Once again, you can see there's some base fertilizer I did here, not much growth. The soil maybe has enough in it. Then I start feeding, I get that rapid extension. When I get out here late in the year, I don't need very much. So in summary, what we're trying to do both with water and nutrition in this is optimize our stress, minimize our stress levels. We need to collect a little bit more information. I know it's something else that you have to do. A lot of your stuff you can plan for right now. I can't do much out there. So I just put up my tables. I kind of schedule when I'm going to do things. I start to figure out kind of roughly what has been done in the past, and then I'm going to use that for the future. All of that stuff is going to be based on climatological data and what I know about my farm, and we're going to track those things. And then as a result of that, we're going to be able to save nutrients and save water. So with that, if there are any questions, let's I'll look at what we've got in our question and answer stuff, and if we need to answer those types of things, I'll come in and answer those. But fill out the evaluation. Let's look at this one answer. So it says, what is the condition of subsurface water? So that's one that Greg asked. Subsurface water is, basically anything that can come up from lower levels. And there are areas in the state that can get access to that, but generally we're looking at soils that in our state, we don't get much benefit from that. We just don't have that much that's close to the surface that can wick up. So I would say that don't even rely on that. Plus our rooting depth isn't deep enough oftentimes to attract it. So let's not deal with that. Bruce asks, I'm having trouble doing the calculations. Where did the 3 inches come from? If you have 2 inches of water per foot of soil, okay, and your rooting depth is 1.5 feet deep, then that means in the top foot of soil you have 2 inches, but you get credit for that another inch that's in the next half foot of soil. So that's in the top 18 inches, we get 3. So that's where that number comes from. And I'll put a little bit more explanation into the typed answer for you, Bruce. Finally, the last question that I think I can answer before, I got a few seconds here. Lori asks, is the size of mulch coverage figured into the coverage coefficient rather than just measuring the plant coverage? No, we only measure the plant coverage. So your rows are 6 feet apart or 5 feet apart. That's your row spacing. You may have plastic covering half of that distance, but we are only measuring the water use relative to it, because remember, our roots are spreading out even into the interrow area. So they will not all be just concentrated underneath the plastic mulch. So we only look at the row width and don't worry about whether we're using plastic mulch or no mulch. So that's important for us to deal with. Okay. Greg was asking about, well water that's pumped up. Yeah. So, I mean, if you have a pump or a well, that's what I want to test, get a soil or get an analysis of, and you can send that to the soil testing lab and they can measure water, and you're going to ask for, I want to know what my water quality is like. That'll tell you a lot about it, but you also maybe want to know if there's any additional nitrogen that's in that water, and that then can be used as a credit.